Before we dive into tonight's tale, make sure to hit that subscribe button if you want more creepy stories that will keep you up at night. It started like any other evening in the small town. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. People were winding down, some finishing dinner, others settling in front of the TV, a few still out walking their dogs. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine from the surrounding woods. Life moved at its usual, unhurried pace. Then the phones buzzed. It wasn't the usual chime of a text or the blare of an Amber Alert. This was different, sharp, insistent, almost urgent. Across town, screens lit up with the same stark message. Emergency alert, follow rules, stay indoors, do not communicate, await further instructions. At first, people barely glanced at it. "Probably another test," muttered Greg, the barista at the local coffee shop, as he tossed his phone onto the couch. Over at the diner, old man Henry chuckled, showing the message to his wife. "Government's got too much time on their hands," he said, shaking his head. But then it happened again. 10 minutes later, the same alert, and again and again. By the third time, the town began to stir. Conversations shifted. "You getting this too?" someone asked in the grocery store parking lot, holding up their phone. "Yeah, but it's got to be a glitch, right?" another replied, though their voice wavered just enough to betray a flicker of unease. Then, as if on cue, the phones went dead. No warning, no gradual fade. One moment, people were scrolling, texting, calling, trying to figure out what was going on. The next, their screens went blank. No signal, no Wi-Fi, nothing. Panic didn't set in right away. Instead, there was a strange collective pause, a moment where the town seemed to hold its breath. People stepped outside, looking up at the sky as if the answers might be written there. Neighbors called out to one another, their voices carrying in the still evening air. "You got service?" "Nope, nothing." "TV's out too." It was then that they noticed the figures. At first they were easy to miss, shadows blending into the edges of the streets, standing perfectly still. But as the minutes ticked by, more and more people saw them. They weren't close enough to make out details, but their presence was unmistakable. Tall, silent, and unnervingly still. "What the hell is that?" someone whispered, squinting into the dim light of a street lamp. No one answered. No one dared to. The figures didn't move, didn't speak. They just stood there, watching and waiting. The town fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the occasional creak of a porch swing or the distant bark of a dog. People retreated indoors, locking doors and drawing curtains. But even behind closed doors, the weight of those silent watchers pressed down, heavy and unrelenting. No one slept that night. Sarah Cooper had lived in this town her whole life. She knew its rhythms, its quirks, its people. She'd grown up on these quiet streets, played in the park as a kid, and now, as an adult, she worked at the local library. It was a simple life, the kind where everyone knew everyone, and nothing ever really changed. When the emergency alert first buzzed on her phone, Sarah had been sitting on her couch, flipping through a book she'd borrowed from work. She'd read the message once, then twice, her brow furrowing. "Stay indoors, do not communicate," she muttered to herself. It didn't make sense. But then, neither did the fact that it kept repeating every 10 minutes. By the time the phones and internet went dead, Sarah was already inside, her doors locked and curtains drawn. She'd always been the cautious type, the kind of person who kept an emergency kit stocked and a flashlight by the bed. But as she sat there in the dim light of her living room, her mind began to wander. Mrs. Grayson. The old woman lived next door, a spry 78-year-old who still tended her garden and baked cookies for the neighborhood kids every Christmas. She was stubborn, too, refused to carry a phone, saying she didn't need one of those contraptions. Sarah's stomach twisted. If Mrs. Grayson hadn't seen the alert. Sarah stood, pacing for a moment before grabbing her emergency radio and flashlight from the kitchen drawer. She hesitated, glancing out the window. The street was eerily quiet, the only movement the faint sway of tree branches in the breeze. Mrs. Grayson's house was just next door, and her lights were still on. That was a good sign, wasn't it? The covered walkway between their houses had been Mrs. Grayson's idea. She'd built it years ago, saying it was for convenience during the winter months. Now Sarah was grateful for it. She stepped outside, the cool night air hitting her face, and hurried along the path, her flashlight casting shaky beams of light ahead of her. The back door to Mrs. Grayson's house was unlocked, just like always. Sarah pushed it open, calling out softly, "Mrs. Grayson? It's Sarah. Are you okay?" No answer. The house was silent, the kind of silence that felt heavy, oppressive. Sarah's footsteps echoed faintly as she moved through the kitchen, her flashlight sweeping across the familiar space. Everything looked normal, the dishes neatly stacked, the calendar on the wall still open to the correct month. Then she stepped into the living room. Mrs. Grayson was there, sitting in her favorite armchair by the window. Her hands gripped the armrests, her knuckles white. Her eyes were wide open, staring at nothing, her mouth slightly parted as if she'd been about to speak. Sarah froze. "Mrs. Grayson?" she whispered, her voice trembling. No response. She stepped closer, her heart pounding in her chest. There was no blood, no sign of injury. Mrs. Grayson looked peaceful, almost, but she wasn't breathing. Sarah reached out, her fingers brushing the old woman's wrist. Cold, too cold. That's when she noticed it, the air. It felt wrong, thick, almost suffocating like the atmosphere before a storm. And there was a smell, faint but unmistakable, metallic like copper or iron, clinging to the walls and filling her nostrils. She took a step back, her flashlight trembling in her hand. That's when she heard it. Tap, 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 soft, rhythmic, coming from the window. Sarah turned, her breath catching in her throat. There, just outside the glass, stood a figure. It was tall, its shape vaguely human, but its head was wrong. No face, no features, just a dark, shifting mass, like smoke trapped in a jar. It didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, watching. Sarah's body moved before her mind could catch up. She bolted, her flashlight clattering to the floor as she sprinted through the house, out the back door, and into the covered walkway. She didn't look back, didn't dare. She slammed her own door shut, locking it with shaking hands, then double-checked the deadbolt. Her chest heaved as she leaned against the wall, sliding down to the floor. The tapping followed her in her mind, echoing in the silence of her house. Tap, tap, tap. The community center was usually a place of laughter and light, birthday parties, town hall meetings, the occasional bake sale. But tonight, it felt like a tomb. Sheriff Daniels had called the meeting in the underground level, a rarely used space with thick concrete walls and a single, flickering fluorescent light. The room was cramped, filled with the town council, the emergency response team, and a handful of others who'd managed to make it there safely. The air was stale, carrying the faint tang of mildew and old metal. Sheriff Daniels stood at the front, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow on the wall behind him. His face was grim, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a tight-lipped intensity. He held a crumpled piece of paper in one hand, though he didn't need to read from it. The words were burned into everyone's minds by now. "This isn't a hoax," he said, his voice low but firm. "We've got people missing. We've got something out there. The rules are clear. We follow them, and we stay alive." Tom Barrett, the local survivalist who worked at the hardware store, leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. He was a big man, with a beard that hid most of his face, but his eyes were sharp, always scanning, always calculating. He let out a derisive snort. "You mean hide," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "We don't even know what we're up against. Sitting here in the dark isn't going to solve anything." Before the sheriff could respond, Sarah's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Mrs. Grayson is dead." All eyes turned to her. She stood near the back of the room, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She'd made it to the meeting through the town's maintenance tunnels, a network of narrow, dimly lit passages built during the Cold War. The tunnels connected key buildings, a relic of a time when the town had prepared for threats that never came. Until now. The room fell silent. Even Tom straightened, his expression shifting from defiance to unease. "What happened?" someone asked, their voice barely above a whisper. Sarah shook her head. "I don't know. She was just gone. No wounds, no blood, just gone." Her voice broke, and she looked down, her hands trembling. Jake Chen, the high school's IT specialist, sat in the corner, hunched over his laptop. The glow of the screen illuminated his face, highlighting the dark circles under his eyes. He'd been working non-stop since the alert first went out, trying to trace the signal, to find some explanation for what was happening. His fingers flew across the keyboard, the soft clicks echoing in the silence. "The emergency alert," he said suddenly, his voice shaky. "It's not from any government server I can trace. It's not from any server I've ever seen before." Sarah frowned, stepping closer. "Then who?" Jake's face went pale. He stared at the screen, his fingers pausing mid-keystroke. "The signal. It's coming from somewhere inside town." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. No one spoke. No one moved. Then the backup lights flickered. The room plunged into darkness for a heartbeat before the lights came back on, dimmer than before. Someone gasped, a sharp, panicked sound. "They're getting closer," a voice whispered. No one needed to ask who they were. The room was already tense, the air thick with fear and uncertainty. Jake's revelation about the signal's origin had sent a ripple of unease through the group, and the flickering lights only made it worse. People shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting toward the stairs, the doors, anywhere but at each other. Then the emergency speakers crackled to life. The sound was jarring, a harsh burst of static that made everyone flinch. A voice followed, distorted, broken, as if it were being pushed through layers of interference. It wasn't human, not entirely. The words were clear, but the tone was wrong, too deep and guttural, like something trying to mimic speech. "Follow the rules. Do not look. Do not speak." The command echoed through the room, bouncing off the concrete walls. For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. Then the lights went out. Complete darkness. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, her ears straining against the silence. Somewhere in the room, she heard the faint rustle of fabric, the soft shuffle of feet. Then a whisper, so quiet it was almost inaudible. "They're here." The words sent a chill down her spine. She wanted to call out, to ask who had spoken, but her throat felt like it was closing up. Then came the choking sound. It was low and wet, the kind of sound that made your stomach turn. Sarah froze, her hands gripping the edge of the table in front of her. A thud followed, heavy and final, like a body hitting the floor. "Hello?" someone called out, their voice trembling. "Is everyone okay?" No one answered. The emergency lights flickered back on, casting the room in a dim, sickly glow. Sarah blinked, her eyes adjusting to the light. The first thing she noticed was the empty chairs, 2 of them. Council members, Mr. Harris and Miss Patel, had been sitting closest to the stairs. Their chairs were overturned, as if they'd stood up too quickly, but there was no sign of them, no blood, no struggle, just gone. The room erupted into chaos. "Where are they?" someone shouted. "What the hell is happening?" "We need to get out of here." Sheriff Daniels raised his hands, trying to restore order, but his voice was drowned out by the panic. Sarah stood frozen, her eyes locked on the empty chairs. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she'd just witnessed. Jake was at her side suddenly, his face pale. "We need to go," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Now." Sarah nodded, her legs moving on their own. She followed Jake toward the maintenance tunnel entrance, the shouts and cries of the others fading behind her. But even as they moved deeper into the tunnels, the voice from the speakers echoed in her mind. "Do not look. Do not speak." The maintenance tunnel was narrow and damp, the walls slick with condensation. Sarah and Jake moved quickly, their footsteps echoing faintly in the confined space. The flashlight in Jake's hand cast shaky beams of light ahead of them, illuminating patches of rusted pipes and crumbling concrete. The air smelled of earth and mildew, and every so often, a faint drip of water echoed in the distance. They reached the hospital's access point, a heavy metal door with a rusted handle. Jake hesitated for a moment, glancing back at Sarah. "You sure about this?" She nodded, though her stomach churned. "We need answers. If anyone's keeping records, it'll be here." The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit corridor. The hospital's sub-basement was eerily quiet, the usual hum of machinery absent. The power was out in most of the building, but the emergency lights cast a faint, ghostly glow. They passed the morgue, its door slightly ajar. Sarah couldn't help but glance inside. The room was empty, the stainless steel tables gleaming faintly in the low light. She shuddered and quickened her pace. Beyond the morgue, they found the records room. The door was old, its paint peeling, and a thick layer of dust covered the handle. Jake pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the room was a time capsule. Rows of filing cabinets lined the walls, their drawers labeled with dates going back decades. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and decay. Sarah stepped inside, her flashlight sweeping across the room. "This place hasn't been touched in years," Jake muttered, running a finger along the edge of a cabinet and coming away with a thick layer of dust. Sarah moved to the nearest cabinet and pulled open a drawer. The files inside were yellowed and brittle, the ink faded but still legible. She flipped through them, her heart pounding as she read the entries. "Jake," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "look at this." He joined her, peering over her shoulder. The documents detailed incidents eerily similar to what was happening now. Towns cut off from the outside world, people disappearing without a trace, and always the same rules. Stay indoors, do not communicate, do not look. This has happened before," Sarah said, her hands trembling as she held the papers. "Every few decades, a town is chosen. The rules, they're not for control, they're a warning." Jake's face was pale. But why? What's the point of warning people if they can't stop it? Before Sarah could respond, a faint hum drew their attention. In the corner of the room, an old monitor flickered to life, its screen filled with static. Jake moved closer, his brow furrowed. "This shouldn't be working," he said, tapping the screen. "The power's out." The static cleared, revealing a live security feed. The camera was pointed at the town's main street. Dozens of figures stood in perfect stillness, their dark forms silhouetted against the dim light of the street lamps. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Are they just standing there?" Jake didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the screen, his face pale. Then one of the figures turned. It moved slowly, deliberately, its head tilting as if it had heard something. And then it looked directly into the camera. Sarah's stomach dropped. The figure had no face, no features, just a dark, shifting mass where a head should be. It felt like it was looking right at her, right through the screen. The feed cut to static. For a moment, neither of them moved. The room felt colder, the air heavier. "We need to get out of here," Jake said, his voice shaky. Sarah nodded, but her mind was racing. If this had happened before, if the rules were a warning, then what happened to the other towns? And why had no one ever heard of them? Tom Barrett had always been a man of action. Sitting in the dark, waiting for something or someone to come for them wasn't his style. He'd spent years preparing for disasters, stockpiling supplies, and learning survival skills. This wasn't survival. This was hiding. And Tom wasn't about to let some shadowy figures and a bunch of cryptic rules dictate his fate. He'd slipped away from the group quietly, ignoring the whispers and protests of the others. The maintenance tunnels felt like a cage, and the longer he stayed down there, the more suffocated he felt. He needed air. He needed to see what they were up against. The surface was eerily quiet when he emerged, the night air cool against his skin. The town looked the same as it always had, the same streets, the same buildings, but it felt alien now, like a stage set waiting for something to happen. Tom adjusted the strap of his rifle and started walking, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. He didn't get far. Sheriff Daniels stepped out from behind a maintenance hatch, his face hard and unreadable. "Tom," he said, his voice low but firm, "you can't leave the protected areas." Tom stopped, his jaw tightening. "Protected areas?" he scoffed. "You call hiding in a hole protection? We don't even know what's out here." Daniels took a step closer, his hand resting on the holster at his side. "I'm not asking, Tom. You go out there, you're putting everyone at risk." Tom's eyes narrowed. "Then shoot me," he said, his voice rising. "Go ahead, because I'm not going back down there to sit and wait for whatever's out here to pick us off one by one." The two men stared at each other, the tension thick enough to cut. Daniel's hand twitched, but he didn't draw his weapon. Instead, he said, "If you step beyond the last streetlight, they take you." Tom laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Yeah, let them try." He turned and kept walking, his strides long and purposeful. The last streetlight loomed ahead, its glow weak and flickering. Beyond it, the road disappeared into darkness. Daniels didn't follow. He just stood there, watching, his expression grim. Sarah had followed the sheriff up, her heart pounding as she watched the scene unfold. She wanted to call out, to stop Tom, but the words caught in her throat. Tom reached the edge of the light and hesitated, just for a moment. Then he stepped into the darkness, and stopped, not frozen, not like the figures they'd seen. It was as if he'd simply ceased to exist. One moment he was there, his silhouette stark against the faint glow of the streetlight. The next, he was gone. No scream, no struggle, not even a shadow left behind. Sarah's breath hitched, her hand flying to her mouth. What just happened? Daniels didn't answer right away. He stared at the spot where Tom had been, his face pale. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow, almost detached. "They don't kill," he said quietly. "They unmake." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Sarah felt a chill crawl up her spine. She looked at Daniels, searching his face for some sign that this was a mistake, that Tom would come walking back any second. But the street was empty, and the darkness beyond the light seemed to stretch on forever. The underground shelter, once a place of relative safety, had become a pressure cooker of fear and suspicion. The survivors huddled together in small groups, their faces drawn and pale, their eyes darting nervously toward the shadows. The air was thick with tension, every whispered conversation carrying an edge of paranoia. Sarah sat in a corner, her arms wrapped around her knees, trying to block out the noise. But it was impossible. The accusations were everywhere. "I saw him leave the tunnel earlier," someone muttered, pointing at a man across the room. "What if he brought them here?" "She was talking to herself last night," another voice hissed. "What if she's one of them?" The words cut through the room like knives, each one deepening the divide. People who had known each other for years, neighbors, friends, even family, were turning on one another. The rules had become a weapon, and fear was the trigger. Sarah glanced at Jake, who was sitting beside her, his laptop open but untouched. His face was pale, his eyes distant. "This is how it starts," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the murmurs. "They don't even have to touch us. We'll tear each other apart." Above them, the figures never moved. Through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, Sarah could see them, tall, silent, and unnervingly still. They stood at the edges of the streets, their dark forms blending into the night. They didn't approach, didn't speak, they just waited, watching. The sight sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. She looked away, focusing on the flickering emergency lights overhead. They were dimmer now, the power fading with every passing hour. Then the emergency broadcast system crackled to life. The sound was sharp, cutting through the noise like a blade. Everyone froze, their heads snapping toward the speakers. A single line of text flashed on the screen, the words stark and unyielding. "When the last light goes out, it's too late." The room erupted into chaos. "What does that mean?" someone shouted. "We're running out of time. We need to get out of here." Sarah's heart pounded as she stared at the screen. The words burned into her mind, their meaning all too clear. The lights were their only protection. Once they were gone, she looked at Jake, her voice trembling. "We need to do something. We can't just sit here and wait." He didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the screen, his face pale. Outside, the figures remained still, their presence a silent reminder of what was coming, and the lights grew dimmer. The maintenance tunnel stretched on, narrow and claustrophobic, the walls pressing in on all sides. Sarah and Jake moved quickly, their footsteps echoing in the confined space. The air was damp and cold, carrying the faint scent of rust and earth. The flashlight in Jake's hand cast shaky beams of light ahead of them, illuminating patches of crumbling concrete and rusted pipes. They had been walking for what felt like hours, following the faint signal that Jake had managed to trace. It led them beyond the town limits, into an area Sarah had never seen before. The tunnel sloped downward, the air growing colder with every step. Finally, they reached a heavy metal door, its surface pitted with age. A faded sign above it read, "Restricted access, authorized personnel only." Jake hesitated, glancing at Sarah. "This is it. The signal's coming from inside." Sarah nodded, her throat dry. She pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. The room beyond was unlike anything she had expected. It was a command center, filled with outdated but functional equipment. Monitors lined the walls, their screens flickering with static. A large map of the town was pinned to one wall, marked with red circles and notes in a handwriting she didn't recognize. In the center of the room was a desk, its surface cluttered with papers and files. A single monitor sat on the desk, its screen glowing faintly. Sarah stepped closer, her heart pounding. The monitor displayed a single file, labeled with her name. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the keyboard. Jake stood beside her, his face pale. "What is this?" he asked, his voice shaky. "I don't know," Sarah whispered, but deep dealt a flicker of something, a memory, just out of reach. She pressed play. The screen flickered, and then her own face appeared. It was her, but different. Older, maybe, or just weary. Her eyes were hollow, her expression grim. When she spoke, her voice was calm but heavy with resignation. "We know they return every few decades. This time, I will be one of them." The words hung in the air, sharp and final. Jake's hands trembled as he stared at the screen. "Sarah, what did you do?" She couldn't answer. Her mind was racing, fragments of memories surfacing like shards of glass. She had been here before. She had stood in this room, watched this video, made this recording. But she had chosen to forget. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She stumbled back, her legs giving out as she sank into a chair. The room spun around her, the air feeling thin and suffocating. I don't remember," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I was here. I knew this would happen." Jake stared at her, his face a mixture of fear and disbelief. "What are you saying? That you're one of them?" Sarah shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. I don't know what I am." The monitor flickered again, the video looping back to the beginning. Her face appeared once more, her voice repeating the same haunting words. "We know they return every few decades. This time, I will be one of them." Jake took a step back, his hands shaking. "We need to get out of here. Now." But Sarah didn't move. She couldn't. The weight of the truth pressed down on her, crushing and inescapable. She had been here before, and she had chosen to forget. The command center felt like it was closing in on them, the air thick with the hum of machinery and the weight of the truth. Sarah sat frozen, her mind reeling as the video looped on the monitor, her own voice echoing in the small space. Jake was pacing, his hands running through his hair as he muttered to himself, "This doesn't make sense. None of this makes sense. How could you have known?" Sarah didn't have an answer. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the screen, from the version of herself who seemed so certain, so resigned. Then Jake stopped. He staggered, his hand flying to his chest as if he'd been struck. His body flickered, just for a moment, like a failing signal on an old TV. Sarah was on her feet in an instant, her heart pounding. "Jake, what's happening?" He looked at her, his face pale and drawn. "They're taking me," he whispered, his voice trembling. "What? No." Sarah grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve. "I won't leave you. We'll figure this out." But Jake pulled free, his movements jerky and unsteady. He stumbled toward the bunker's main power core, a massive console covered in switches and dials. His hands moved quickly, flipping switches and turning knobs with a sense of urgency. "Jake, stop!" Sarah cried, rushing toward him. "What are you doing?" He turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "The tunnels, they're not for protection," he said, his voice strained. "They're containing something we trapped here long ago." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "What are you talking about?" But Jake didn't answer. His body flickered again more violently this time, like he was being pulled apart at the seams. He reached for the final switch, his hand trembling. "I can stop them," he said, his voice barely audible. "But you have to go, now." Sarah shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, I'm not leaving you." Jake's eyes met hers, and for a moment, he looked like himself again, the quiet, kind IT specialist who had always been there when she needed him. "You have to," he said softly. "It's the only way." Before she could respond, he flipped the switch. A pulse of darkness erupted from the console, rippling through the bunker like a shockwave. Sarah was thrown back, her body slamming into the wall. The air crackled with energy, the lights flickering wildly. Outside, the figures screamed. It was a sound unlike anything Sarah had ever heard, high-pitched and guttural, filled with rage and pain. She crawled to the window, her vision blurry, and saw them. Dozens of figures, their dark forms writhing and twisting as the pulse swept through the town. One by one, they faded, their bodies dissolving into nothingness. Sarah turned back to Jake, her heart breaking as she saw him collapse to the floor. His body flickered one last time, his hand reaching out toward her, and then he was gone. The room fell silent, the hum of the machinery fading into nothing. Sarah sat there, her body trembling, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. Jake was gone. The figures were gone, but the cost was too much to bear. The first light of dawn crept over the horizon, casting a pale, sickly glow over the town. Sarah sat in the driver's seat of an old pickup truck, her hands gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The engine rumbled softly, the only sound in the eerie stillness. She had driven through the streets slowly, her eyes scanning the empty sidewalks and silent houses. The town was empty, not abandoned, but erased. No signs of life, no signs of struggle, just nothing. The emergency evacuation route had been easy to find, the signs still standing despite the chaos of the night before. The road stretched ahead, winding through the surrounding woods and out into the open countryside. Sarah didn't look back. She couldn't. Her phone buzzed on the seat beside her, the sound sharp and jarring in the quiet cab. She glanced at it, her stomach twisting as she saw the familiar message. Emergency alert. Follow rules. Her breath hitched. She picked up the phone, her hands trembling as she swiped to open the alert. The message was the same as before, but this time there was no location specified. No town name, no boundaries. It was everywhere. Sarah's mind raced, fragments of memories surfacing like shards of glass. She had been here before. She had done this before. The bunker, the tunnels, the figures, it wasn't the first time. It had never been the first time. She had helped them before. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She had been part of this, part of whatever force or entity was behind the rules, the warnings, the disappearances. She had chosen to forget, to live a normal life, to pretend it had never happened. But now she remembered, and it was happening again. Her phone buzzed again, another alert flashing on the screen. She didn't need to read it to know what it said. The rules were the same. The outcome would be the same. Sarah tightened her grip on the wheel, her jaw clenching as she stared at the road ahead. The sun was rising now, its light spilling over the horizon and casting long shadows across the asphalt. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't know if there was anywhere left to go. But she couldn't stop. Not now. The phone buzzed again, the sound relentless. She reached over and turned it off, tossing it onto the passenger seat. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, but it didn't last. Somewhere in the distance, a faint hum began to build, a low, resonant sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Sarah's heart pounded as she glanced in the rearview mirror. The road behind her was empty, but the shadows were growing longer, and the hum was getting louder. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more creepy stories. Stay safe, and see you in the next nightmare.